Some days feel different, like the world itself has hit the pause button. Everything is still, untouched by noise or movement, and in that rare, precious silence, solitude transforms into a true blessing. No voices cutting through the air, no distractions pulling me away, just an unclaimed moment where I can finally sink into my own thoughts. By the time I made it home, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. The day had drained me, body and mind, and as I shut the door behind me, kicking off my shoes, I felt the weight of it all start to slip away. Today, more than any other, I craved peace, real, uninterrupted peace. A chance to escape, to breathe, to exist without expectation. So, I decided to treat myself. A little home spa ritual, something simple but indulgent, just for me. I headed straight for the bathroom and, with a flick of my wrist, set several candles alight. I arranged them carefully along the shelves, lining the edge of the bathtub, their golden glow flickering against the dim room like tiny sentinels of warmth. As the hot water poured in, filling the air with soothing steam, I added a few drops of lavender and rosemary oil, their scents curling together into something soft and familiar. Slipping into a silk robe, the fabric smooth as water against my skin, I poured myself a glass of wine. The first sip was rich, deep, like velvet warming me from the inside out. With each slow swallow, I could feel my muscles beginning to relax, the tension in my shoulders unraveling as if the wine itself had coaxed it away. Finally, the bath was ready. I let the robe slide to the floor and stepped into the inviting heat, the water embracing me completely. Closing my eyes, I surrendered to the moment, the only sound in the room the gentle crackle of the candle flames. The warmth seeped into my muscles, unraveling the last knots of stress, and I let my mind drift, massaging my shoulders with slow, deliberate movements. For the first time all day, I felt like I was truly unwinding. But just as my thoughts started to dissolve into the quiet, I heard it, a sound so small it barely registered. A soft creak, faint but distinct. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or maybe the old wooden floor shifting. But something about it felt off. My senses sharpened, cutting through the fog of relaxation. I opened my eyes and instinctively turned toward the door. The tiny gap between it and the frame was just wide enough to reveal the faintest hint of movement, something shifting, barely there. My body stiffened, my heart kicking up a notch. My first thought was a burglar, but it was too quiet for that. Maybe it was my nephew, Kyle. He had a bad habit of dropping by unannounced. But why now? Why at this hour? I stayed completely still, the water lapping softly around me, not daring to make a sound. My eyes stayed locked on the door, the second stretching into something endless. And then, I saw it. A face. It was just, standing there. Motionless. Watching. Unfamiliar features, eyes too large, too dark, staring straight at me with a gaze that sent an unnatural chill down my spine. It wasn't just staring, it was studying me, assessing me, like a predator sizing up its prey. My breath hitched. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Kyle? The name scraped from my throat, barely more than a whisper. The moment the word left my lips, the figure jerked back, retreating into the darkness as if it had been caught in the act. In an instant, it was gone, swallowed by the shadows beyond the door. I sat frozen in the bath, my skin prickling with unease, my heart hammering against my ribs. What the hell had just happened? What was he doing? Why was he standing there in complete silence? And most importantly, what did he want? When I finally forced myself to move, I climbed out of the water, my body trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something nameless and raw. Wrapping my robe tightly around me, I tried to shake off the feeling that had wrapped itself around me like a heavy fog. I thought the bedroom would offer some kind of refuge, but the unsettling feeling followed me, clinging like static electricity. That night, sleep never came. I lay tangled in my sheets, thoughts churning, unable to push away the image of Kyle's face hovering in the dim light of the bathroom doorway. Morning arrived, but it didn't bring relief. Dragging myself downstairs, I headed for the kitchen, hoping that daylight would somehow make sense of what had happened. The sun spilled through the windows, warming the room with golden light, and for the briefest moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it had all been in my head. A trick of exhaustion, a strange dream, a moment my mind had warped into something worse than it really was. But that illusion shattered the second I stepped inside the kitchen. Kyle was there, sitting at the table like he'd been waiting for me. His hair was a mess, tangled and unkempt, his expression heavy, his eyes lidded with exhaustion. He had definitely been up all night. He knew I was there, of that I was sure, but he didn't acknowledge me, didn't move. Just sat there in complete stillness, as if waiting for something. For me to speak first, maybe. His gaze found mine and held it, unblinking. It wasn't just staring, it was burning, pressing into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My breath hitched, my face warming under the weight of it, shame creeping up my spine for reasons I couldn't quite explain. And in that moment, I knew, whatever had happened last night, whatever I thought I had seen, wasn't a dream. At that moment, I felt like a stranger in my own home. A guest in a place that was supposed to be my sanctuary. "Good morning," I said, though the words felt dry in my throat, barely making it past my lips. Kyle didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me in the slightest. He just sat there, staring, his eyes dark, unreadable. But there was something in that gaze, something sharp and deliberate, like he was sizing me up. A shiver ran down my spine. And then, without a word, the corners of his mouth curled into a slow, measured smile. It didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't friendly. It was calculated, intentional. Something about it made my blood turn to ice. That smile wasn't one of warmth, not even close. No, there was something unnerving about it, something that sent a deep, instinctive warning through my body. Dread welled up in my chest, thick and suffocating, but I forced myself to stay composed, to pretend I wasn't rattled. And yet, the look on his face told me otherwise, told me that he knew exactly what he was doing. It wasn't casual. There was something behind it, something tangled up in an internal struggle I didn't understand. A flicker of desire, maybe, mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite put a name to. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said it. "I saw you yesterday." His words hit me like a slap. My breath caught, my heart lurched. For a moment, my mind simply refused to process it. I had never thought of myself as an easily shaken woman. At 57, I was no stranger to solitude. I had long grown comfortable in my own company, come to appreciate the quiet, the moments where I could retreat from the relentless demands of the world. My home had always been my fortress, a place where I could shut out the chaos. But last night, something had shifted, something I couldn't explain. Kyle sat at the table, leaning back slightly in his chair, utterly at ease. Meanwhile, I walked into the kitchen with the same quiet confidence I always carried, the same sense of ownership over my space. But today, it felt different. Like I was walking on unsteady ground. Like I wasn't as in control as I wanted to believe. He was eating breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice, going through the motions as if nothing had changed. And yet, it had. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, something neither of us was willing to name. I moved to pour myself a cup of coffee, the sound of liquid hitting ceramic absurdly loud in the silence that stretched between us. I sat across from him, staring into my cup, my thoughts tangled and restless. Should I say something? Should I acknowledge what had happened? What I had seen? Even just thinking about saying it aloud felt dangerous, like it would shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy still barely holding everything together. But the silence was suffocating. It demanded to be broken. "Kyle," I said at last, my voice even, almost detached. I forced myself to meet his gaze. He looked up, unblinking, waiting. "There's something we need to talk about." My words were measured, careful. Kyle didn't move. He just placed his fork down, slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. The barest twitch played at the corner of his mouth, like a smirk he was trying to suppress. I took a steadying breath. "Last night," I started, though the words felt heavy, unnatural. "I heard footsteps. Saw you at the door." My pulse quickened. I tried to keep my expression neutral, tried to stay composed, but inside, my mind was racing. Kyle didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me, his brows lifting just slightly. "I heard water running," he finally said, his voice impossibly smooth, disturbingly calm. "Thought the faucet was leaking." It was a logical enough explanation. Rational, even. But something about the way he said it, the carefulness of it, the precision, felt off. Like he had rehearsed it in his head before I even asked. I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes on him. "Next time, just knock," I said, my tone softer now, as if I was trying to let the moment pass, to bring the conversation to a close. But then, just as I thought we were done, he smiled. It was barely there, just a flicker at the corners of his lips, but I saw it. And then, still holding my gaze, he said, "Or maybe, I like watching you do it." The words were quiet, too quiet, but they carried weight. There was no teasing in his tone, no mockery. And yet, something about it felt like a challenge, a dare left hanging between us. I froze. For a split second, it was like the world itself had stopped turning. And in that eerie stillness, I felt something unfamiliar tighten in my chest, a cold, unrelenting knot of unease. Kyle, however, didn't seem affected. He simply turned back to his breakfast, carrying on as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shattered the last thread of normalcy between us. But I felt it. The shift. The silence between us stretched in the days that followed. We still spoke, still went through the motions, but there was something different now. Something unspoken yet undeniable. Kyle avoided my gaze more often than not, but sometimes, I'd catch him looking, watching. And the moment our eyes met, he would turn away, too quickly, like he was afraid of what I might see if I looked too closely. Or worse, afraid of what I might understand. The tension between us grew, thick and suffocating. An invisible undercurrent that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. At times, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking, overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I knew better. Something was off. And no matter how much I tried to push it aside, the feeling had settled deep in my gut, stubborn and unshakable. One evening, after the house had settled into its usual quiet, I found myself alone with my thoughts. The silence, once my refuge, now pressed down on me like a weight, thick, suffocating, filled with words left unsaid. We were in the living room. I was flipping through a magazine, pretending to read, though I hadn't actually processed a single word. Across from me, Kyle sat slouched on the couch, eyes on the TV. At least, that's what he wanted me to think. But it wasn't the TV I felt. It was him. And it was the silence between us that screamed the loudest. "Kyle," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but firm enough to cut through the stillness. He turned his head slightly, meeting my gaze. His eyes held no fear, just exhaustion, maybe a little curiosity, but mostly, resignation. Like he'd been waiting for this. My heart thudded in my chest, but I pushed forward. "I think we need to talk about this." My voice was steady now, more certain. "We can't just pretend nothing happened. We need to clear the air before it," I exhaled, shaking my head. "Before it eats away at us." His face remained neutral, that same carefully constructed indifference he always wore. But his eyes told a different story. There was something there, something I couldn't quite place. A flicker of something between curiosity and something else. Something I didn't want to name. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. "What you saw," I started, hesitating for just a second before regaining my footing. "It's none of your business. But since it happened, I owe you an explanation." Kyle didn't move, didn't blink. "Everyone deserves their privacy," I went on, keeping my voice measured, controlled. "Especially when they live alone." Still, he said nothing. But his silence was different now, calculated, waiting. Like he was hoping I'd trip over my own words, give something away. I squared my shoulders. "You're not a child," I added, my tone firm. "You're an adult. There's no shame in any of this. There's no need for embarrassment. No need to make this more complicated than it is." For a brief second, I thought I saw something, a tiny smirk, the barest twitch at the corner of his lips. But it was gone before I could be sure. He just sat there, watching me, saying nothing. And that emptiness, the weight of it, settled over me like a heavy fog. I had spoken. I had tried to explain, to smooth things over. But somehow, instead of closing the gap between us, it felt like I had only widened it. After a long moment, Kyle stood up. He met my gaze one last time. "Good night," he said, his voice even. Then he walked away, disappearing down the hall. And I was left sitting there, more confused than ever. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen, bracing myself for the same routine as always. And there he was, sitting at the breakfast table, calm as ever. On the surface, nothing had changed. He still carried that easy, casual air, still moved with the same controlled, deliberate ease. But when he looked up at me, I saw it. Something different, something cold. A quiet, calculating look in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the usual indifference I had come to expect from him. No, this was something else, something deeper. Like he was studying me, analyzing me, searching for something. Or maybe, waiting. And for the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling. That look haunted me. It followed me, clung to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I moved through the morning in a daze, my mind wrapped in a fog I couldn't clear. No matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to him. To every glance, every fleeting look, every shift in his posture. Even when he said nothing, his presence left a mark, and I couldn't understand why. Was it his honesty, so blunt, almost childlike in its simplicity? Or was it the rare, unguarded moments where he revealed something deeper, something raw? Kyle was unlike anyone I had ever known. But then, doubt crept in, whispering its way into my thoughts. That can't be right, can it? I found myself standing in front of the mirror, searching my own reflection for answers. The soft lace of my robe clung to me, accentuating the curves that had, even after all these years, remained intact. I wasn't blind. I knew I looked better than most women my age. That had always been a quiet comfort, a subtle source of pride. And yet, today, it didn't matter. Today, it didn't bring me joy. Because the turmoil wasn't in my reflection. It was inside me. Deep, unsettled, restless. A sharp knock at the door jolted me out of my thoughts. I jumped, my pulse kicking up. I hesitated for just a moment, torn between ignoring it and answering. But before I could decide, the door swung open. And there he was, Kyle. His eyes met mine instantly. Something flickered across his face, a subtle shift, just enough for me to notice. And for a split second, it almost felt like the air between us had changed. You always look incredible. His voice was low, smooth, sincere. His gaze lingered, not just on my face, but lower, taking me in, his eyes dragging over me like a slow, deliberate caress. It's hard to imagine you could be more beautiful, he murmured, tilting his head slightly, but somehow, you've outdone yourself today. The words sent something warm curling in my stomach, a mix of pride and discomfort. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I quickly turned away, pretending to focus on the jar of cream in my hands. Anything to ground myself. I smoothed it over my skin, the motion automatic, almost mechanical. But even as I did, I could feel him. Standing there. Close. Too close. His presence filled the room, thick and impossible to ignore. And then. A touch. Barely there, but unmistakable. His fingers brushed my shoulder, light and fleeting, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I barely had time to react before I felt it. A subtle pressure as he adjusted the strap of my robe that had slipped down. It was such a simple, almost insignificant gesture, but the second his fingers brushed against my skin, my breath hitched. His touch was delicate. Intentional. Too intentional. I couldn't move, couldn't even turn around. The weight of his presence, of this moment, pressed down on me, making it impossible to think clearly. You're beautiful. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he wasn't even speaking to me, but to himself. A thought slipping past his lips before he could stop it. I didn't turn. I couldn't. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, wrapping around us like a secret neither of us had meant to share. His hand lingered for a second too long before freezing, as if he had just realized what he was doing. I heard him inhale softly, drawing in the moment itself, savoring it, before slowly exhaling, like he was trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. Then, barely above a breath, he murmured, "Your scent, it's dizzying. Like spring itself." My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. Each frantic beat felt like a warning. A signal. A line being drawn, or erased. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. He wasn't just Kyle, the kid I had tried to guide, the one I had explained the world to, the one who had looked to me for answers. That wasn't how he was looking at me now. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't youthful admiration. This was something else entirely. And it terrified me. Instinctively, I took a small step to the side, putting just enough space between us to breathe, to think, to remind myself what this was and what it wasn't. But was it wrong? That question gnawed at the edges of my mind, refusing to be ignored. Because this wasn't new. Not really. There had always been something there, something unspoken, something lingering beneath the surface, something I had convinced myself wasn't real. A pull I couldn't explain, an energy that made the air between us feel charged, alive. Not just sympathy. Not just fleeting attraction. Something deeper. Something more dangerous. Something that felt inevitable. Kyle's voice broke through the haze of my thoughts, as if he could hear every one of them. "You have no idea how much you inspire me," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Not just because of how beautiful you are, but because of who you are. You're different. You're something special." The words hit me like a spark to dry kindling, igniting something in my chest that spread like wildfire. I stared down at my hands, still holding the jar of cream, gripping it like it could somehow ground me. I needed something to anchor me. Because I felt like I was floating, adrift in a storm of emotions I hadn't been prepared for. Doubt crept in, thick and suffocating. Was I imagining this? Was this real? And even if it was, what the hell was I supposed to do about it? Because something had shifted. Something between us had changed. We had stepped over some invisible threshold, and now there was no going back. Kyle must have felt it, too, because he moved carefully, sitting down at the edge of the bed. His posture was stiff, tense, shoulders rigid, hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were pale. He didn't look at me, didn't meet my eyes. But I could feel the storm raging inside him just as much as I could feel my own. And then, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he finally spoke. "Can you teach me everything you know?" The words came out rough, almost strained, as though he had barely managed to push them past his lips. "I want to be better," he continued. "Better at everything." I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. Because I knew this wasn't just about knowledge. This wasn't just about learning. Kyle wasn't asking for guidance. He was asking for something much deeper. He was asking how to live, how to feel, how to carry himself with confidence. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest, heavy and undeniable. A soft laugh escaped me, light but unsteady, breaking the tension just enough to make the moment feel real again. I leaned toward him and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, casual, nothing more than a fleeting touch. But my heart was pounding. "Let's start with this," I said, forcing an easy tone, though the energy crackling beneath my skin was anything but controlled. "When you're ready, you'll know." That was supposed to be the end of it. But then he looked up. And the second our eyes met, something inside me shifted. His gaze was intense yet soft, this impossible contradiction of confidence and vulnerability, experience and innocence, restraint and desire. I felt it like a pulse, a current running through the room, changing the very air between us. And I knew he felt it, too. Because he didn't move away. Didn't retreat. Instead, he leaned in just slightly, his posture loosening, his hesitation melting away. And then, as if by accident, his hand brushed against the strap of my robe where it had fallen from my shoulder. His fingers barely touched me. But I felt it everywhere. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The words were an apology. But the way he had touched me, the way his fingers had moved, slow and careful, with an attention that felt deliberate, it didn't feel like an accident at all. And my body knew it. A slow warmth spread through me, curling deep in my stomach, leaving goosebumps in its wake. The air between us thickened, the tension pressing in, suffocating and electric all at once. For a second, I thought I would pull away. I thought I would step back, say something to reset the moment, to remind both of us where the lines were drawn. But I didn't. Because the idea of moving away from him, of breaking whatever was happening between us, felt just as wrong as crossing the line itself. Kyle must have felt the same hesitation because suddenly, he froze. His expression shifted, his eyes widening slightly as if he had just realized something important. And then, just as softly as before, he whispered, "Your scent, it's like spring." The words slipped through the last of my defenses like a blade, cutting through everything I had so carefully built up. And just like that, I laughed. It wasn't forced. It wasn't controlled. It was pure instinct, an attempt to mask the chaos unraveling inside me, to pretend I wasn't on the edge of something I didn't know how to name. "Kyle," I began, my voice steady even though my mind was racing. "Smells, feelings, they're just part of the game. But the real challenge, the real lesson, is learning to control them. You can't let your emotions make your choices for you." He watched me closely, his gaze intense, like he was trying to absorb every single word, letting them sink deep. It was the kind of look that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking, but I could feel it. He was listening, really listening. And maybe it was because of that, because I saw something in his eyes that I recognized, that I decided to open up. I told him about my own struggles, the times I had been confused, the mistakes I had made, how I had learned, sometimes the hard way, how to navigate through all of it. Because the truth was, growing up wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about always knowing the right answer. It was about recognizing your flaws, facing your mistakes, and, most importantly, not being afraid to embrace who you really are. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it forces you to see parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. Kyle nodded slowly, his expression shifting. His eyes softened as he took it all in. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue. But I could see it in the way he looked at me. He understood. Something unspoken passed between us, something bigger than words. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just teaching him. I was teaching myself, too. Because life wasn't about rules. It wasn't about expectations. It was a process. A damn messy, complicated, unpredictable journey. Sure, there were struggles. There would always be struggles. But there were also moments like this. Moments where something shifted. Where you saw yourself or someone else a little more clearly than before. Moments where you grew. And then, just like that, Kyle exhaled, like he had been holding something in for too long. His whole body seemed to relax. The tension I hadn't even realized he was carrying melted away, and suddenly, he wasn't just the person sitting across from me. He was someone I could truly connect with. The air between us had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was charged, real, tangible in a way I didn't quite have words for. And then, as if the weight had lifted completely, Kyle laughed. A real laugh. Light, unrestrained. And just like that, the tightness in my chest eased. I laughed too. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself just exist in the moment. His laughter was like oxygen, something that made everything feel a little easier, a little lighter. And yet, beneath all of it, the warmth, the ease, the simple joy of sharing a laugh, something else was stirring inside me. Something deeper. Something that had nothing to do with the moment itself and everything to do with what it meant. It wasn't just excitement. It wasn't just emotion. It was something else entirely. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second over and over in my head. Kyle was a mystery to me. And, somehow, a mirror. Reflecting things I hadn't wanted to see. His words. His eyes. The way his touch had lingered in my thoughts, like a promise I didn't understand. But what did it mean? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain, whatever it was, whatever was happening between us, it wasn't something I could ignore.